Hello again, everyone. This is Randy, your sewing machine man, and today is serger day. We don't do many sergers, we just review them and such, but we've been having a lot of folks here lately have been making some real straightforward, simple to fix uh, problems that I'm just going to give you a quick rundown for the last 10 sergers that I worked on. Here are what caused the malfunctions. Number one is almost always threaded incorrectly. And I've been known to say that every serger I fix starts out threaded incorrectly. Sometimes that's all there is to it, is me just threading it correctly. But they start out threaded incorrectly because number one, sergers are a real challenge to thread correctly. And there's people who've had the same serger for years and years, and they'll inadvertently get it misthreaded one day. Even if it's just a matter of not pulling the thread down in between the tension discs. If they're laying there, but they're not pulled down in between the disc, if they're not in there, so when you pull, you feel the resistance. When you thread these things up, you can reach down here and you can pull on the threads after they're threaded. When the pressure foot's down, you can pull. You'll feel resistance between every spool, and here there's a tension assembly on every machine. So if it's not in between the tension discs, you will get a malfunction if if you go pull on it, you don't feel resistance like someone's actually got a hold of it. You got to feel resistance there. Otherwise, it's not threaded correctly. And getting it in the guides, every single guide is important. If you get it out of a guide, it'll just make a bad stitch. And as far as the lower looper, whenever a machine's unthreaded and I rethread the machine, I always take the needle plate off to thread the lower looper. I can't imagine trying to thread the lower looper without taking the needle plate off. 2 screws, sometimes 1 screw. But otherwise, you're doing it blind. You really can't tell. And of course, they have all these self-threading and threading assisted, blah, blah, blah. It's hype. It's sales nonsense. Take the needle plate off, thread your lower looper. That's the only way you're going to know it's threaded. And then once you thread it, put this back on, of course, and you always take the lower looper thread and you slide it back up under here, and then put your needle plate on with your thread underneath that, so you don't pin it down. Always make sure that your thread is coming out like this from your lower looper when you put it back on. That's the main things I've seen just this week with folks with their sergers misthreaded, and I'll be with them on the phone and I'll say, is there any chance you got this misthreaded? And they will honestly say, I've threaded it 100 times, one of those had to be right. Well, there's more than 100 ways you can thread a sewing machine, this one particularly, 4-thread serger, and be wrong. There's thousands of ways you can thread it and it be wrong. You have to know how to thread this like you know your own name, like you tie your own shoes. You have to get the threading right. And as far as threading goes, it could be as simple as the wrong thread with a spool cap on top and the back. It's just so many different ways to get the threading wrong. But threading, double check, triple check, use your book. It's got to be right. It can't be close. Now, the wrong needle or not installed correctly, quite often, this says use only HA1 1SP needle. Okay, that's just a standard Singer needle, HA1. Any standard Singer needle, Kenmore needle, Bernina needle, whatever. You know me, that's a standard needle. That's what it takes. Make sure it's pushed all the way up in. Make sure it's not bent. Make sure it's not a size 16 and not a size 10. I think 11 to 14 is what it says here. 11 to 14. If it's too small, your looper will be too far away from it. If it's too big, your looper will hit it. Real simple. 11 to 14, that's what they mean there. So make sure that's the right needle. Make sure it's fresh out of the pack. Make sure it's not bent. Make sure it's not blunt. It's got to be new. A burr on the looper. Here's what a looper looks like. This is your lower looper. That's what I was talking about. It passes in behind the needle. As a needle rises, it comes behind and catches it. So if a little burr gets on the end, you can catch your nail on it. Just a tiny little fish hook burr on the end. You got to polish that off. What I usually use, if it's really bad, I'll use fine emery cloth that you can get at the Home Depot. You polish it off, get the burr off. If it's really, really fine, or even after I use that, I'll use this crocus cloth also, right next to the emery at the Home Depot. Polish it up. It's for polishing and making it nice and smooth. And that goes for either looper, the upper looper or the lower looper. Of course, Nothing I say today is going to involve a tool. There's no tools involved. This is just observation. I try to keep people away from their serger with a tool because you have to find the problem first. And it's usually one of these little problems. Rather than getting the screwdriver and starting turning screws, then I can't help you. It's just game over. If you're turning your hand wheel and you want to see, people say it's a timing off, you turn your hand wheel and you'll notice that the looper, upper looper, comes in behind the lower looper, and it passes behind it. Simplest thing in the world. And it goes through this little notch right here. It comes up right in behind it. As it goes left to right, it goes right behind it. And that's what catches the thread from the back and puts it in front of the needle. So if that's not touching and that's picking that up, you don't have an alignment problem there. So on your loopers, sharpen the points of them back up. Don't adjust them at all unless they're hitting, and then it needs to be adjustment, and you don't want to be the one that does it. Trust me. If there's a burr on the needle plate, there can be a burr anywhere around here where the needle has hit it. These can be bent. They're very fragile. I'd always keep an extra needle plate if I had a serger, at least one. These can be bent. They can be bent, usually bent down. They can be bent over. They can be snapped completely off. But I would keep an extra needle plate handy, because if your needle plate isn't pristine or functioning properly, you're not going to make very good stitches, if you make any at all. Let's see, burr on the presser foot. The needle passes right here. Each needle goes right on either side of this right here. And if the needle's sewn on something too heavy, a lot of times it'll deflect, or if it gets hung up in the threading up here, if the tension's too tight, it'll pull the needle one way or the other, and it'll hit this. And you can see little dings and scratches on there. Again, get out your emery cloth, get out your crocus cloth, polish that off. That has to be smooth. The thread chains off of that. It slides right off to the back. If it hangs up, it'll jam, cause a malfunction. Now, see, burr on the presser foot, needle plate, looper. Okay, what can happen sometimes is the tension really is off. Sometimes people say, yeah, I think the tension's off. They know they got it threaded correctly. Almost every machine has a zone. You can see 4, 3, 2 on here. See that bar in between? That's your zone. 2, 3, 4. That's where you're going to be. 2 on the light side, 4 on the big side. So you start out at 4 or 3, and you make your adjustments. You're almost always going to be in that zone. 4, 3, 2. Every machine, when I stitch them out, I put them in that zone, and then I fine tune them. Sometimes this will be 4, 3, 2, 2, but make sure it's in the zone. Make sure your thread's pulled down in tight, so it's between there. Sometimes it's as simple as that, if the tension's off. If these are set like this, you don't have a tension imbalance. Trust me. Sometimes the thread tower in the back is off. The thread tower is this little guy right here. This is when you put your thread on the spindle, and the thread tower's back here. Now this one's not as easy to get out of whack, but if it's turned sideways, that thread's going to turn off the top of the spool and hang as it goes. That should be directly right above the hole. The lead should be directly right above the thread, so it comes straight up and over. Ones like these are a little bit more problematic, because you can take these and turn them 180 degrees wrong, and all your spools are pulling the wrong direction. You'll have a fit trying to get it straightened out. So make sure it's to the right direction. I encourage people to get a pen or a magic marker and just put this on there, so when it gets bumped inadvertently, you know this faces toward the operator, and if it's away from you, it'll malfunction. Something as simple as that can cause malfunction on sergers, because they are persnickety. Okay, knives. You can have a knife like this. You can have a knife like this, depending on whether it cuts from the top or the bottom. But you see, that's a carbide. It has 2 layers there. Carbides, these are like 10 to 1 on the softer ones. There's usually a carbide combined with a soft one. Carbide on the top, soft on the bottom, or vice versa. But you rarely need to replace a carbide knife unless they have a chip out of them. If they got a chunk out of them where you hit a pin or something like that, then they might need to be replaced. But these will go a long, long time. The other ones, they get real shiny. They can be replaced. They're cheap. These are not cheap. They're a little bit more. So this is the lower guy, and they'll get real shiny right along there. You'll get real shiny, then you know, and they won't cut. A lot of times people won't cut because they're trying to sew on something that's too heavy. So the serger actually does 3 things when a serger performs. It feeds, it cuts, then it sews. Sewing is the last thing that it does, just about. So you're back there, you sew. Let's bring this down so you can see a little bit better. cuts, and the fabric moves as it's feeding, then it sews. If it won't cut it, it won't feed it, it won't sew it. It's like every other machine. If it's too heavy, don't use it. You can't accomplish it. You have to use the correct size of fabric. It's going to be something, let's say shirts and jammies and blouses and pillowcases. You try to make that big fluffy foam wrapped deal for your doggy bed or kitty bed and put it in there and try to sew it. Trust me, it's not going to work. Anything heavy, if it won't cut it, it won't feed it, it won't sew it. Sometimes your knife setting, people trying to get a tension adjustment when the thread won't line up or along the edge there. There'll be a gap between. It'll be over about 1/4 of an inch because the knife is too far over. And that's down under here where your knife, you turn that makes a knife move left or right. If it's too far to the left, it will cut out here. It'll cut in here rather, and it'll overflow and it'll have a gap of thread hanging over. So you take your knife and you move it back to the right and it'll fill up that gap. Sometimes it's as simple as that. But these are all the things. I could probably make 10 videos on this instead of one with 10 items. But actually, these are the things you check before you call the guy or before you get the screwdriver out. And please do me a favor. Don't turn any screws on your serger until you've checked all those things. Any one of those things can cause a malfunction. So don't grab the tools. Do observations. Check for burrs. Make sure it's threaded right. Make sure you got the right needle. HA1 or JL1, whatever it is. There's so many different kinds of serger sticks, so many different kinds of needles. But all those things are important. Check with those. Then call your guy. All that stuff you can take care of. If it's something involving a screwdriver, you don't want to be that person. So just let somebody else who's a little bit more skilled take care of it. Appreciate it. Thanks.